Hey guys, I'm sitting here with Dave Jackson from the School of Podcasting. He was inducted to the Podcasting Hall of Fame in 2018. He launched the School of Podcasting in 2005. He's the author of the book Profit from Your Podcast: Proven Strategies to Turn Listeners into a Livelihood. Over the years, he's launched 30 different podcasts with over 4 million total downloads. You can find more information from him at schoolofpodcasting.com. Dave, welcome to the show.
Jase, thanks for having me. Yeah, I will probably start another podcast in the middle of this one. It's just something I do.
I heard a stat that there was like a podcast launched every minute or something in 2020. So maybe half of those were yours, or
yeah, something like that. It's crazy. But yeah, it's getting easier and easier to launch. Yeah. The fun part is getting them to grow. So that's the tricky part.
100%. So tell us, obviously you have over 4 million downloads now, which is an astronomy of a number. Where did you start? Like, what was the first podcast? You seem to be kind of ahead of the curve of podcasting.
Yeah, I started, my background's in teaching. And so I was teaching people a lot of Microsoft Office and QuickBooks and time management and customer service in the corporate world. So I was already building websites and things like that. Mm-hmm. And at the time, I had a pretty decent website for musicians. It was all about how to get more gigs and sell more CDs and things like that. And one of my listeners said, "Hey, have you heard about podcasting?" And I'm like, "What's a podcasting?" And I remember I Googled it, and there was 1.5 pages. That was it. And I was like, I think we broke the internet because there's nothing on this topic. Yeah. And when I finally parted one together, and I just took content I already had, which was a newsletter for musicians, mm-hmm. and I just started to put it out as a podcast, which I'd already kind of figured out that just audio was better because I was interviewing musicians. And at the time, and I listen now and I cringe, but I literally had like a speakerphone with a mic in front of it, and I'd be interviewing them that way. But just having that on the website, people were like, "Oh, wow, this is really cool." So I'd already seen where audio is a better form of communication because you can be sarcastic and you can have dramatic pauses and things like that. So I just took what I was doing as a newsletter and put it out as a podcast. And then probably 4 or 5 months after that, I had so many people saying, "Well, how do I do that? Like, I want to start a podcast." So that's when I started the School of Podcasting.
Okay. So your music letter podcast, whatever that was called, started about 4 months prior to your School of Podcasting. Are you still doing the music one too?
I shut that down after about 11 years. It was originally called the Musician Cyber Cooler because it was supposed to be like this. And because back then the internet was called cyberspace.
Oh yeah.
And then as cyber started to be get synonymous with sex, I was like, okay, let's lose cyber. Yeah. So then it was the Musician's Cooler. And I had a big picture on my artwork of a water cooler, and people still didn't get it. They're like, "Is it like wine coolers?" Or like, what's the, no, like, no. So I changed the name again to the Marketing Musician, and finally people went, "Oh, I get it now." Yeah. So that's why all my stuff is like just, School of Podcasting, Logical Weight Loss, weekly web tools. I like names that like people don't have to go, "Wait, what's that show about?" So.
Yeah, let's talk about that for a little bit because that's a big topic that comes up. Many different forums online and Facebook groups and that kind of stuff. And they're like, "What do I name my podcast?" They're all trying to come up with a clever name, but then when you're searching for it, like it doesn't stand out as something that you want as a listener. So like, what should somebody be thinking about when naming their podcast?
Well, number one, Google is a great tool to see, is anybody else doing a podcast with a name outside the box? Because right now there are about 7 thinking outside the box podcasts. And I'm like, you guys are not thinking outside the box when it comes to naming your show. I had a client of mine once, and he was going to call his show After the Darkness. And I go, and here's my test. I say, go find not your mom or your cousin. Go find people who you think are your target audience and say, "Hey, I'm going to do a show called After the Darkness. What do you think it's about? And somebody said vampires. Somebody else said, isn't that a band from the 90s? And then like nobody guessed. And I said, okay, tell me again what your show is about. And he goes, it's about my life after blindness. And I go, that's the name of your show. So I've seen, there was a TV show called Stargate, and I forget, there was like this big portal thing that was in it, and they named the podcast after the portal, but Stargate was nowhere in the name. So it was a very inside baseball kind of thing. And it was just doing miserable. And I said, well, why don't we take that and just put a colon and say, an unofficial Stargate podcast. And instantly their numbers went up because people weren't searching for this inside baseball thing. So you kind of have to think about, what are people going to search for? And then you don't want to get too cute. Like when it's like the mompreneur-arian kind of, you make up these words that don't exist, because right now, not a lot of people are listening on smart speakers, but it is getting easier and easier. And especially now with Amazon Music getting involved, to where you can now just say, hey, what's her name in the tube, play the School of Podcasting, and she'll bring it right up. So if you have a word that you can't say, smart devices are going to be like, wait, how do you spell, whatever kind of thing. So, totally. And I always say, just brainstorm a bunch, and then I'm all about getting feedback. I mean, why guess, is this going to work or not? Find some people, and then if you get it down to about 2 or 3, see which domain is available, and see if your domain spells anything funny. So if it's like School of Arts, please realize that you have a domain now that is School of Farts. You know what I mean? It's like, and make sure it's easy to say. One of the benefits I've gotten from podcasting is I now work for a podcast hosting company, and their name is Libsyn. It's short for Liberated Syndication, but the 400th time I have to explain Libsyn is short for Liberated Syndication in a day, you want to go hang yourself. For a while, I called my consulting arm of the School of Podcasting, I called it it was a podcast fast pass. And that was the problem, is I had to say fast pass, because if I said podcast fast pass, people are like, wait, sassafras, what was that again? So make sure it rolls off the tongue, make sure it's easy to spell, and that's a good place to go. But that's really the first thing people are going to see. Yeah. So you want it to be somewhat kind of obvious.
Yeah. Well, there's a reason I called this podcast How to Make Money Podcasting.
Yeah, that's it.
It spells it right out. Yeah. So right away then, with the newsletter, were you monetizing like your newsletter, and then how did you end up starting to monetize podcasting?
Yeah, I was doing it mainly. I had a book. I'd started off, and I originally hadn't intended to make any money. It was just a newsletter, and I like to network with people. And somebody said, wow, this is really good stuff. You should put this together and sell it as a book. And I was like, oh, okay. So that's kind of how that started. And then the fun part, if you work in a training department, is about every 7 years, they're going to hire a bunch of salespeople that can't sell training. And instead of firing the guys that can't sell, they downsize the training department. So to make a long story short, I lost my job and went to get another job in training. My original degree was in electronic engineering. I was going to be a technician. I fell into the training department of a company. And now when I went to get another training job, they're like, you don't have a degree in education. I was like, crap. So I had to go back to school. And at the time I was like, I need a job that is flexible, that I can kind of work around my schedule. And at that time, podcasting was taking off, and so were membership sites. And I was like, I've seen so many kind of things come and go that I was like, oh, I should have jumped on that. I should have jumped on that. And I was like, all right, everybody and their brother is saying this is going to be big, and membership sites are big. I'm like, I'm doing it. Yeah. So I started a membership site to teach people how to podcast. So it's funny because at the time I needed to kind of get some money going fairly quickly. Yeah. And that's the worst thing you can do in podcasting. And I proved it. That's why I was also doing, I was doing guitar lessons. I was building websites on the side. I mean, you name it. Yeah. I was doing it as a side hustle, because back then in 2005, nobody knew what a podcast was. And then they're like, well, do I need an iPod? I'm like, no, so there was a lot of education that had to happen. And then once they finally understood what a podcast was, you're like, do you want to start one? And they're like, no, but thanks anyway. So that's why the kind of first wave of podcasting was all the geeks, all the technicians, all the techie people, because they were the people that could figure it out. That was before, Apple had kind of moved in. So they moved in later, towards the end of 2005. But the first couple months were just brutal. So so that's how that started.
So you said it was a slow start. I mean,
Yeah,
making nothing, $100, $10. So was it paying at least your costs to put it in?
Yeah, the first thing that we all do is we think, if I could get 50 people to pay me, and then you insert $5. Yeah. And you're not going to get the thing. As I did more research, you're not going to get 50% of your audience. You're not going to get 20% of your audience. You're not going to get 10% of your audience. You're probably going to get somewhere between 3 to 5% of your audience. And people are like, that can't be right. And I'm like, go do some research. Cause I have one podcast I do a live call-in show on Saturday called Ask the Podcast Coach. And I was amazed because I'm pulling 8%. And that's like insane. I was like, holy cow. And then I looked at my weight loss show, and I'm pulling 0.2% on that one. I'm like, well, you put those two together and there's your 4%. So, so it was hundreds of dollars. I mean, it was keeping me in my phone, in insurance and books, because I'd gone back to school. And I lucked out. My brother was like, hey, I'd also just gotten divorced. My brother's like, hey, come live in my basement and until you get back on your feet. So had that not happened, I would have had to get a part-time job or something to go along. But at the time, it was cool. I had all these little irons in the fire. And when I research people that are actually making a living at podcasting, they're not just doing sponsorships, which for the record is it's like the worst way to try to monetize your show. They have their own product. They are doing crowdfunding, they're doing affiliates, they're doing it's all of them. It's usually not just one type of monetization. It's multiple ones.
For sure. So with the membership site, that's where you started. Did you ever start making money from that, or did you realize that
well, the first thing when I started, it was $5.
Okay.
And finally a friend of mine said, can you name anything on the web on the internet that's worth anything that's $5? And I went, that's a really good point. And so what I found was I went up to $20, I think, at that point. And I started, and it's weird, I actually got more people, because when you underprice your stuff, people are like, well, that can't be any good.
Yeah.
Like that's holy cow. So I went up to 20, and my marketing strategy was, well, I'm going to help people start a podcast. And then people will go, well, how did you learn how to do that? And they'll say, oh, you need to go talk to Dave. And I had an affiliate program. And the problem was, at $20, I was getting more people to sign up, but there wasn't enough skin in the game. They would sign up and do nothing, so it was like, what the heck, so I finally,
it was that $20 a month, or is that?
Yeah, $20 a month. So, and I had some people, sign up, and I had some people that were, going through the paces, and they were launching, and I still have some of those people, which is amazing. But eventually I just raised my price until people started saying no. And right now it's at $49 a month. And so, and the other thing, what I found was, when I got to $49, people sign up and they're emailing me going, how do I get started? And that's the people I want to work with.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, here's you go. And to me, it scratches my teaching itch, because I got people now that actually want to start. They want to jump in. They're eager to go. And not that the people at $5 a month weren't, in quotation marks here, great customers, but they weren't doing anything.
Yeah.
And it didn't fit into my plan. So that's one thing I found out. If I could go back to myself, at the time I was doing some editing, because people would say, I like this talking into the mic thing, but I hate editing. And so I was doing that a little bit, as another form of income.
Yeah.
And then eventually I had a friend of mine that was doing it. And I said, hey, here's the deal. If you have anybody that needs a consultant, send them my way, and I'll send you these people, because I don't really want to do editing. It takes a ton of time, and I don't have the patience for it, especially if I have to listen to somebody's show that I don't like. That was brutal. And so that worked. But I've since figured out, if I could go back in time, I would have put together a team to do that under my umbrella, because I've now started doing that. I have a team now, because what I found out is, and it's nothing against my friends, but they have this relationship with their customer, and now they're their editor. So they're kind of now the guru. And So they want to ask the questions from that person because that's who they have a relationship with.
Yeah.
And when they say, "Oh no, you need to go talk," even though they're giving me they're referring people to me. They're like, "No, really, you need to go talk to Dave." That person really wants to learn from them, and so that's when I was like, "Okay, I'm about 15 years on late on this, but I need to get together a group of people who can be my editing team." So, but I've seen that happen a lot. I talk about it in the book. Daniel Day Lewis is a friend of mine, and he did a show he still does it. It's called The Audacity to Podcast. Well, there's free software called Audacity. And Daniel meant it in a way of like the courage to podcast. And it was kind of play on words. And Daniel's background was in designing websites, beautiful websites that cost 4 figures for somebody to put together. Well, okay, so now you got people who are interested in a free piece of software. Those are not the people that are going to spend $1,000 to get a website made. But he had attracted this audience, and he's like, okay, well, what do they need? Well, they're really into reviews. They're trying to, get to the top of the charts in Apple and, all this other stuff. And so he went in, and he's kind of a nerd, and he, hired a team and other things and made products for that audience. So sometimes it's a matter of, okay, I didn't attract the audience that I wanted, but what does this audience need? Because that really is the best way to monetize your show, is to have your own product. Because when you develop and deliver let's say it's a weekly show, whatever the schedule is, if you can meet that schedule on a regular basis, now you're trustworthy. When you deliver things of value, they like you because, wow, thanks so much for the help. And if you can kind of share a little bit about yourself as you're doing the podcast, now they know you, they like you, and they trust you. So when you say, hey, I have a book out, I have a course out, I have coaching available, you can buy my webinar, whatever it is, they're going to buy it. So that's really the key, but that doesn't happen overnight. That's the problem. That know, like, and trust thing is not going to happen in 6 weeks.
Yeah. So the $1 million question, when, so this, and it's going to be different from everybody. I understand that.
Yeah.
But I know there's somebody listening, or many people listening, that are like, okay, if it's not 6 weeks, when is it?
Yeah. What do you think? Do you have a guess?
What I tell people from my experience is give your podcast 3 months, 90 days, and then look up and see where you're at.
That's a good thing.
Because then you'll have all the how to do it and how to, manage your guests and all that down. And then you can start looking up. But I'm curious to know your. Yeah,
nobody likes this answer. And you had part of it right. It's 3 years. And people are like, wait, and it's like, because the first year you're awful if you did like most people and just launched. Okay, so you're finding your voice. So by the end of year 1, you've got it now, and you're delivering value. So your audience starts to grow, and that audience is going to start telling their friends. So by the time you get to year 3, now we've got an actual audience. And people are like, wait a minute, what about John Lee Dumas, Entrepreneur on Fire? That guy was making money after 6 months. I go, of a daily show. And I go, so when you take John's show and make it weekly, guess what? 3 years. And I've got about 6 clips now of people that I have. Then like when somebody asks them, when did you start making money? About 3 years. And then another person, oh yeah, 3 years after I launched the podcast, this happened. And it's just one of those things, like, how like when you buy, I don't know, a car and it's a green Volvo or whatever, and all of a sudden everybody in the neighborhood has a green Volvo. It's one of those things that I was at an event and I heard somebody say 3 years, and I was like, that's about right. I now hear it all the time. And nobody wants to hear that. And what's kind of scary about the podcast space is people will pay much more money than I'm charging to pay someone to sell them hope. And they'll just like, no, it doesn't have to be 3 years. And there are some people that do it under 2, and it kind of depends on your niche and how much how much time are you spending taking the kids to soccer? Because that was the other thing I always pointed out. John Lee Dumas is a friend of mine, but he's got no kids. He's like, he had 6 figures in the bank when he came back from being in the Army. I'm like, he had a pretty long runway. Like, let's compare apples to apples. And by all means, John is a talented guy and super focused, but you can't compare yourself to that. So that's one of those things where, it takes a little while. And if you think about it again, if we go back to, if I was a an author, I'm not going to like take my first draft and put it out and like, holy cow, New York Times bestseller. How lucky am I? No, it takes a little while, you know, or that actor or that athlete or anybody that it takes some time to get there. And that's why I always say, whatever your podcast is about, it has to be something that you would talk about for free, because when you first start, not only is it not free, it's going to cost you a little bit. But on the other hand, I always say, you know, one of my hobbies is riding my bike. And I go, I spent $220 last year with a tune up and a new set of gloves. I go, and I put money out because it's my hobby. I like doing it. It's fun. So, you know, you're probably gonna have to put out some money for your podcast.
Yeah. And it would probably also depend on, you know, what kind of audience you're having beforehand. You know, if you're like an influencer, you know, quote unquote, whatever that really means, or an athlete that's well known, you know, you can probably come in with a little bigger audience from somebody, you know,
well, that's couch. Everybody sees Joe Rogan and he got that nice $100 million payday. Joe Rogan started comedy in 1989, you know, so it's like, and then he was on TV and then he was doing this and that. I'm like, so, and it doesn't always equal if I have I've seen a lot of people that come in from Instagram or Twitter and they're like, no, you don't understand. I have 28,000 followers. And I'm like, that doesn't mean it's a little bit like YouTube. You know, I think right now, close to 2,500 subscribers on my YouTube channel. I just started it. But if you look at it, I get maybe 150 views on a video. So subscribers does not always equal views. In the same way, you know, it's always kind of fun when you hear these people go like, but don't you know who I am? And I'm like, you know, one of my favorites was there's a comedian who was really famous in, I think the late 80s. His name was Andrew Dice Clay. And he started a podcast and he thought it was radio. And he kept doing resets, like 15 minutes into the podcast. He's like, you're listening to the Dice Man. And he's like, and I'm like, it's not radio. It's not like I tuned into the middle of this, you know? And I know probably 10 years ago, Kathy Lee Gifford tried a podcast, you know, and even the ones that have gotten money, Amy Schumer got a deal on Spotify and, you know, it was supposed to be exclusive. And then she didn't really get that huge of an audience because it wasn't that good. She just kind of rolled in as like, oh, we're just going to improv. And I'm like, improv usually does not work. Yeah. I mean, I've seen, I was in Chicago once and I went to Second City. So this is like people that do improv for a living. And I'm going to say a good 70% of those skits were like, okay, that's 4 minutes of my life I can't get back. You know, so it's one of those things where, you know, it definitely helps if you have a following. Yeah. But just don't get too upset. I'm starting to notice where YouTube and podcasting are almost completely different people. Yeah. I mean, podcasting, in my experience, podcasting doesn't correlate to like any other type of following. I mean, you post something on Instagram and you get a ton of likes or, you know, whatever shares, and you know, you get like 3 more listens than you normally would, you know, and who knows if that was from Instagram or just the guest or whatever. Well, but I'm curious to go down the road of number of downloads, and does that have any bearing on when you're ready to monetize? Not always. It is if you want to do the Casper mattress, stamps.com, you know, Harry's Razors, those kind of things. Those guys are looking for 20,000 downloads per episode, not per month, per episode. And about 8% of people that start will get to that level after years of doing it. So you're looking at a 92% failure rate to get the big name sponsor. But at a client of mine who had a son who was pretty high on the autism spectrum, and she loved Disney.
You're breaking up a little bit.
So downloads. Oh, all right.
Oh,
am I back?
We're back? Yeah, now you're back. I just have to say it. I just have to say you're breaking up, and then you're back.
There you go. So I had a client of mine who did a show. She had a son that was kind of high on the autism spectrum, and she started a show called Special Mouse, and it was all about taking people with special needs to an amusement park. She had hundreds of downloads, never this huge audience, but yet she got a sponsor. How did she get a sponsor? Because there was somebody in Florida that specialized in, you guessed it, transporting people with special needs. Now, was she making a living on that? No, but it definitely paid for the podcast and then some. And the other thing that she did is she had a Facebook group. So these people would find her podcast and they'd be like, I thought I was the only person going through this. So it was a really tight, knit kind of community kind of thing. So that's a case. The more niche you are, in some cases, you can actually charge more because let's look at a triathlete, right? So these are the people that are biking. What else do they do? They run and whatever. Mm-hmm. And so let's say you had a product specifically designed for triathletes. Okay, I could advertise in Shape Magazine and Men's Magazine and Running Magazine and all these other magazines and hope that, well, some of those people might be triathletes. Yeah. But now I've got a podcaster. He's got 800 triathletes listening every week. I will pay more money because I'm trying to get to those people.
Yeah.
But if I'm doing a show about, building more confidence, okay, we all need a little more confidence, but it's, that's everybody needs that. Where if I make it building confidence for new parents, oh, okay, now we've cut out some people, but I've now got the attention of new parents. And I'm like building confidence for new interracial parents. Oh, wait a minute. Now we just cut out half my audience, but the people that are left are like, oh my gosh, you're talking to me. And if there's a product that fits that audience, they're going to pay to get to it. So you can't be everything to everybody.
For sure. We are getting close to the end of the time here, but I wanted to touch on the product side. You said the best way to monetize is selling your own product, course, ebook, book, whatever that is. If somebody's starting a podcast, and now we kind of have a timeline, 3 years, so they're probably like, okay, that was a lot longer than I thought initially. Anyways, but if they are coming up to that point where they're a couple of years in, and they're saying, I don't even know, what product I could make or create. Like, how would you go about that process?
Yeah, I just did this, and it gets you out of your comfort zone because a lot of podcasters are introverts. Mm-hmm. And I said it on my podcast, and I still have an email list, and I said, I need to talk to you. I need you to help me. I'm working on this thing, and I need your feedback. And I set up one-on-one Zoom calls for a half hour. And that is, a little freaky for some people. They're like, I get to meet a bunch of strangers, but they're not really strangers because they listen to your show. 100%. And in fact, it's kind of weird because in some cases they kind of fanboy out because they're like, oh my gosh, I'm talking to Dave Jackson. I'm like, really? Trust me, it's not that big of a deal. And just ask them, like, what's your biggest struggle that you're dealing with in whatever your genre is? What's your biggest frustration? What would it look like? And you just go through, if you just Google like all the questions, you're doing market research. Mm-hmm. And then you find out that, well, my biggest struggle is blank. And then you go, all right, how can I solve that? And then you go, now you're the investigator, and you either find somebody to build that for you, or if you have the skills, you build it or write it or whatever. Yeah. And that's, I always say it's kind of like the Secret Santa. Have you ever had to do one of those awful things at work? They're like, we're doing and you're like, no. Like, can we do gift cards? No gift cards. Oh, come on. you find out you get Harold in accounting, and I'm like, I couldn't point at this guy. Like, Harold in accounting. So what do? You ask somebody in accounting, like, hey, what is Harold like? And they're like, oh man, he loves the Philadelphia Eagles, man. He's a big fan of their quarterback. So you go out and you buy a jersey of the quarterback for the Philadelphia Eagles. You give it to Harold, and Harold is like, can that guy be my Secret Santa every year? Yeah. And it really is a matter of like figuring out, okay, who is my audience? What do they need? Mm-hmm. And then you just go find a way to give it to them. And it's I know Adam Curry, who's the guy that invented podcasting, he always calls it value for value. So if I give you something of value, you're going to give me something of value called money. Yeah. And, so that's it in a nutshell, but it takes a little while sometimes to figure out what do they really need and things of that nature. And I've just been lucky where people like, do you know anybody who does editing? And when I first started that, I was like, yeah, me. Like, how much are you willing to pay for that? I don't know. I'll pay you $50 an episode. Done. you know. So sometimes you don't know that until you jump into your audience, and they're like, "Do you know anybody that does this?" And you're like, me."
Yeah.
Or I'll find somebody that you can white label, to do that.
100%.
So, yeah.
Awesome. Cool. Well, obviously, School of Podcasting, you can find more about Dave and what he's up to. Is there anywhere else, Dave, that people can follow along?
If you want to check out my book, Profit from Your Podcast, that is at profitfromyourpodcast.com.
Awesome. And I'll have links to that in the show notes or wherever you're listening to this clip and stuff. So, Dave, thanks so much for being on the show. It was great having you and great conversation.
Thanks, man.